quite fascinates me, which is glutamate, which is one of the major neurotransmitters, as we both have discussed, of the mammalian brain. And it's one of the few substances that cross the blood-brain barrier. So glutamate is quite an important substance within my overall hypothesis, because it has been known and it has been measured that at the point of death there is a build-up of glutamate within the brain, something called a glutamate flood. And glutamate clearly is linked in some way to what is happening with your son. And we both, Ed and I, have discussed this over the years, that by taking out glutamate out of his diet, you could effectively bring down the glutamate levels in the brain to such an extent that would show improvement. And I think you found that, didn't you?
We did. This is one of those areas that is quite controversial. So in the health service in the United Kingdom, I don't believe there's a recognition or an understanding of glutamate itself and intolerances to it. There is clearly understandings about gluten.
Yes.
And in fact, people, celiac sufferers will vouch for that. And so there are many things, remedies and interventions for people who suffer from gluten intolerance. But glutamate intolerance, if I can dare call it that, is not very well talked about or known about, to the point where Marty's GP was unable to even recommend tests that would show an intolerance of that or not. But on reading myself about glutamate, I was able to make a lot of connections, which may or may not be right, but they nevertheless yielded some really good results. So at the time when he was the onset of his psychosis, when he was about 21 years old, 20 years old, at that time we knew nothing, and the psychiatrist who was assigned had no other option but to medicate, because the risk appeared to be so great in the family environment and also outside, and medication appeared to be the only remedy for that. And to be honest, we didn't resist. We did to begin with, because we don't like medication, but it was so difficult. The threat to family, life and limb, possessions, the public, was so great. And so we succumbed to the medication answer, if you like. But we found that the medication went up and up and up, and whatever life Marty had went down and down and down. And he was on a very high dose, and for 12 months or so on the highest dose he could be on, that he was on in that period. And really, not a lot of change. His psychosis was still there. The people who were in his head were still there. The jumping from being who he is to this alien being in our home who we didn't recognize, and who didn't recognize us. It was like he was seeing us through a cloudy mist.
Right.
And that we were maybe some part of another world at these times, and he was locked in his inner world. And that's what we observed during these periods, and they could go on for days. You know, it could be minutes, but it could go on for days.
Well, we have said, haven't we, in the past when we've discussed this, that it sometimes seems as if Marty lives in this either a permanent present, or the past and the future are not the same for him. He doesn't have the same perception of time, does he? Time is different.
He doesn't. It's so hard to be objective, though, isn't it, when you're dealing with something like this? How does someone else perceive time? It would be easy for me to say he's only ever in the present, but I'm not inside his head. But what I do think is that he doesn't comprehend time the way we do. He doesn't use it in the same way that we do. So he will talk about events, but in a very different way. For example, he will recall instances that go back many years in our recollection, in our world, and he will talk about them like they were now.
Right.
And we're going to talk in a few minutes about how he seems to talk about things that haven't yet happened in our world.
Yes.
That seem to be like now. But what
can I ask one question?
Yeah, sure, Denis.
when you say that he thinks that things that happened way in the past are now, are you talking about things in your family and his life, or are you talking about things in his prehistory or other things?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. That's a really interesting question, because until you ask that question, you may be surprised to hear this, I don't think I'd thought of that. But I'll go away from this interview, and I'll probably recall instances that would be explained by what you just asked. Instances where he may have said things that we probably didn't think about, that may have come from some prehistory thing, pre-our history. But no, I was referring to things which we recognise in our lifetime with him.
Okay. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just thought of that. I just was curious if
it's a very good question.
Maybe now you can watch for that.
Well, it's one of
maybe
the
now you can watch for that.
Yeah, I will do. I will do.
Because it's one of the things, really, that your question really stimulates us to move on. Because one of the things that Marty has shown, which Ed was touching upon there, is the most peculiar ability to know things that are absolutely impossible for him to know. And whenever Ed has phoned me up when these events have taken place, I have been absolutely stunned about these. Now, there are two events that particularly I'd like Ed to talk about and explain. One of them is the Jimmy Ruffin event, and the other one is the one about the drawing and the terraforming. If you'd explain this, this is amazing.
We start with the second one, the drawing and the terraforming thing, because in a way, this happened a couple of years back, didn't it?
Yeah.
And in a way, that was the first inkling I had that something strange was going on. The background, really, very quickly, is that I have a friend who lives in New England, and who I've known for some time through business, and we kept when I lost touch with her around about 8 or 9 years ago. We kept in touch through internet, email, and things like that, and the occasional phone call. And she has a son who is about Marty's age, and when I was in New England, goes back to the year 2000 or so, and met her son, it was remarkable how she felt that my story was similar to her own with her son. And we went away, I went away, and then around about 4 years ago, my son Marty was, we were trying to find something to occupy his time, and we found that some of the computer tools were quite useful for him in his head, although I don't want to get into him being a savant in computers. He's definitely not, and he actually hates computers most of the time. But he did like drawing, and he liked railways and things associated with trains and so on. And he created a scene in this little tool that was on the computer. He created this scene which was of an island or a peninsula, and in this peninsula he drew a track around it. And then he drew a large property inside the peninsula. He drew some islands off this peninsula. And I asked him where that came from, because it looked like he was deliberately drawing these things. These shapes seemed to be deliberate. And I said, why is that island? And he says, oh, there's another one here as well. So he did 2 little islands off this peninsula. And I happened to be talking to my friend Karen on the phone in New England shortly after this. And I said, you never guess what he did. He's done these things and he drew this thing. And she said, can you describe what he did again? And I described it to her, and she said, do you know, I live there. And I said, pardon? She said, yes. Are there 2 islands? And I said, yes. And he said, how can you know that? And she said, well, who knows? And she said to me, and the other day, Ed, you were telling me that your son had been talking about a character that was in his head that was called Demetrius, or Dimitri, I think he called this character. And he would go on and on and on. He said he would look into a mirror and he would see Dimitri. And she said, remember when you told me about Dimitri? Well, my son was writing about Dimitri.
Wow.
And I thought, nah, there's a lot of Dimitris in the world. Probably the most common name in the world. But then she recalled that I'd said that my son, when describing Dimitri to me, had said, Dimitri's Greek, and they hate him, but he's a great leader, and he's in charge. And I got the books out, and I learned that there was in fact a character named Dimitri who was a great leader, who was hated. Now, okay, there may be many of those too, but you start to get this suspicion that something's going on here. It's easy to construct connections between things when there are coincidences.
But I think we have to really point out here that your son is a young man living in Liverpool. How on earth would he know the name Dimitri? Dimitri is not an English name.
It's not even in the curriculum at school.
It's not even there. So Dimitri, the chances of a young man like your son realising, coming up with a name like Dimitri, knowing he was Greek, and then the same young man over in the United States coming up with the name Dimitri as
but
well.
not knowing why.
But not knowing why. So here we have some kind of a synergy.
Was the gentleman in the United States studying that Dimitri, the very Dimitri that you found that...
Not in my knowledge. The young man in the United States was probably 2 or 3 years younger than Martin, and certainly his mum had no recollection of them doing that, studying those things. But again, we don't know. Many things like this can be explained.
That actually answers my question, because obviously he is seeing stuff out of prehistory, or by prehistory I mean before his,
At that period in my son's psychotic period, if you like, this was early on, so this is when he was around 2021, and in that period he was very much focused on this Dimitri, very much so. It's changed since then. He's become something else, another Spanish name, since then, but Hispanic type name. But is Dimitri no, it's probably Greek, isn't it?
No, Dimitri is Greek. Yeah.
So, but if we move on a little bit, the second instant that you mentioned probably convinces anyone that there's something strange going on.
This is singularly one of the weirdest things I've heard.
And has a third party who witnessed this, and a very sensible, level-headed third party who witnessed this. But it's a very simple story, but a very deep and significant meaning to it. It goes back just 3 or 4 months, and at a time where my son had been seeing a psychotherapist recently. I mentioned that earlier, and my wife and I dropped him at the psychotherapist's practice, which is actually his home, and we then disappear for 45 minutes and have a cup of tea or coffee somewhere else, and leave Marty with Tony Cole. And this particular time we were sat in a cafe nearby, and there was pipe music in the cafe. It must be about a mile from Tony's home, and there was pipe music coming through, and it was my era. It was soul music and things like that, and it wasn't radio. It was some kind of CD or something that was playing. But it was my era, and so they were playing all these Motown things and soul things and so on and so forth. And I remember What Became of the Broken Heart came on, and my wife says, "I bet you don't know who that is who's singing that." And I said, "Yeah, it's Jimmy Ruffin." And she says, "Okay." So we always have these competitions about who knows who. And so we mentioned his name, and we thought, that's great, and it moved on. And we looked at the watch, and we got back in the car, and we drove back to Tony's house. And we went in, and as ever with these things, we would sit down, and Tony would then debrief us about anything that was interesting that he'd learned or they'd shared while we were gone. And as he's doing this, our son just smiles and watches, and he just looked up, and in the middle of a conversation he just said, "And don't forget Jimmy Ruffin." And my wife and I just looked at each other, and Tony saw this, and he said, "What's the matter?" And we told him the story, and he thought, how did that happen? And it wasn't like we heard it in the car, or even for months and months, years. I can't recall him ever saying Jimmy Ruffin.
And again, why would he? You know,
Why
again,
would
it's
he?
not his generation. It's not.
Not at all. But it was the way he said, and by the way, don't forget Jimmy Ruffin, right in the middle of a conversation. And I asked him why he said that, and he moved on to something else. So, explain that.
Wow.
It was
Wow.
clearly in our consciousness, and he picked up an energy from us. And he's done that before.
Right.
There was a small incident at home about 2 years ago. Again, probably in the worst of his psychotic period. And we were always very nervous about doing things that he didn't like. You know, he had all the obsessive behaviours that autistic people seem to display. And so we were very careful not to touch things if he didn't want us to touch things, or move things if we didn't want to move things, and so on. And it wasn't just that he would be unhappy because of his psychosis, he'd probably thump me, you know.
Yeah.
So we were kind of afraid of doing things as well. And we in the house one day, and a parcel arrived for him that we'd brought, something to do with trains, I think, and it was still packed. And I wanted to see it. You know, we'd spent quite a lot of money on this thing. I wanted to see it. And I said to him, would you like to open it for us so we can see it? And he says, no, I'm not going to open it. And we said, come on, let's have a look at it. He says, no, I'm not going to open it. So what are you going to do with it, Mart? And he says, I'm just going to leave it packed. I think, this is great. You know, he spent all this money and he's not going to open it. But okay, that's maybe all he wanted. So he left the room and went upstairs and took himself into the bathroom. And I just looked at my wife and says, should we have a sneaky look? And he darted out the bathroom, down the stairs, and grabbed me by the shoulders and says, do not think of opening this. Just like that. And my wife looked at me and says, what, is he reading our minds? And that was only one of many times when we thought he was reading minds in the house.
Right.
Now,
Have you? It seems that what's happened is somehow his brain is wired differently.
Oh, yeah.
Than most people. I mean, that's obvious.
yeah.
But do you think that because we supposedly the right ones or whatever, you know, do you suppose that we're using our brain for so many things that something like that may be picking up your thoughts or whatever? Our brain doesn't have time or whatever to do that, where he has some free time in there to be able to adjust that ability.
Yeah, well, you know, Denis, I think knowing Tony here has helped enormously for me to come to terms with what all this may mean and where it might come from. By the way, Tony, you may want to adjust yeah, pretty good, and just spin it over towards your chair a little bit. Just a couple of degrees. That's it. You're back on again.
Yeah.
You're back there. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah, beautiful.
So we got some more light. Fantastic. Let there be light.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's another subject, isn't it? Of course.
Yes.
So yeah. I think knowing Tony and reading his stuff and having conversation with people like who join in with the forum and so on has helped me to think more about what this all may mean and where it all may come from. So yeah, what we have found.
It's totally fascinating. Tony, will you do me a favor? I hate to interrupt, but I think it should be injected here. Will you tell the audience how to get to your forum and how to join and that type of thing? Absolutely,
I certainly will. You can actually go onto my website, which is anthonypeake.com. So that's www.anthonypeake. That's Anthony with an H and Peake, PEAKE.com. And if you want to go to the forum, just put /forum on the end and you'll go directly to the forum. Or if you go onto the website, you can just click on one of the little units and it'll put you straight through to the forum. Because that forum we have now approaching 560 people on there from across the world. We have neurologists, we have psychiatrists, we have psychologists, we have mediums, we have all kinds of experiences. Ed is a regular on there. We have people who have lucid dreaming. So clearly we're very much wanting to get as many people involved in this as possible, because as I always stress, the work I do is nothing more than a hypothesis. My writing is very much saying to everybody, look, this is what I think may be happening, but I need input from people to say whether this makes sense or not. And this is why what's happening to Ed's son fascinates me, because Ed's son touches upon so many of the areas of the things I'm talking about. And I know there are people out there who either experience temporal lobe epilepsy, have autistic children or whatever. But one of the things that both Ed and I have discovered is these people have powers, and they seem to be able to attune into things that are denied what I would call ordinary people, which are the statistical majority. But they're differently abled, and it's a question of helping them get out of that trap of being differently abled.
Actually, that's probably a good point to continue.
Let me say one more thing. I know, Anthony, you're usually on for an hour. If you guys continue, I don't know how long we've been on because I'm so fascinated in this subject. You guys can continue all the way up and use as much of the 2 hours we have as you want to.
Okay.
So that'll stretch it out where you can give us more information, because this stuff is totally fascinating to me, and I know it is to Rick too. So
thank you.
Sorry for the interruption.
There's a lot of stuff.
I just want to make that point. Okay, guys, go ahead.
I was just going to say that perhaps to give people a background about to what may be going on in the head of people like Mart. I'm very careful to say may, because there's many people who will watch this sequence and who are professional in psychiatry or neurology and disbelieve some things or question or challenge some things. And all of the things, the opinions that those people have, are important to me and to our family. But it's inspired us, or perhaps educated us, or contributed in some way to what I'm forming in terms of an understanding. Okay, so there's nothing that's closed to me in terms of understanding. So I need to say that very quickly. So let me describe what Marty's psychotherapist said to me a couple of weeks back. He told me that he was at a training event for psychotherapists that was held in Holland some time ago, some years back. And there was a famed psychotherapist lecturer who was presenting this training. And this particular session that he told me about had been prepared specially by the teacher, the lecturer. He'd taken 12 of the audience and prepared them in some way for a particular session he was going to run. And he planted them back in the audience, unknown to everyone else in the audience. Then he announced that he was going to ask for 2 volunteers to come from the audience, one to play therapist and one to play client. Okay, and the client would be someone with a condition like this that they couldn't understand, a psychiatric condition of some kind. And so he pulled 2 unsuspecting victims out of the audience, and he sat them down in their respective chairs across a table. And then, before they were allowed to start, he pulled his 12 people out of the audience who were prepared, and he stood them behind the client. And Tony, if you listen to this, forgive me if I get any of the detail wrong. He then asked the therapist, or the person playing the therapist role, to start his consultation with the client, in spite of the 12 people who just arrived. And so the therapist began something like, okay, please tell me a little bit about how all of your problems manifest themselves. And before the client could open his mouth, one of the people stood behind him, a very forceful individual, said, do not tell him anything. You know what happens when you tell him anything. No one believes you. They all think you're stupid. They pass you to someone else. You fill in more forms. You do all these things. It's a waste of time. No one helps you. Don't do this. And as this guy, the client, sitting there thinking, what's happening now? Someone else pipes up from behind him and says, and addresses the person who's just spoken, saying, why do you always pick on him? Why do you always stop him? You know it makes me cry and I get upset by these things. And he then shouts to this person and says, shut up, you. This has nothing to do with you. You always make him weak. You know, I'm trying to make him strong, and you make him weak. And it's your fault that he's like he is. And as he's doing that, someone else pipes up in the audience, in the 12, and says, don't pick on her. She's only trying to help him. You know how weak she is sometimes. She cries now. And he says, that's because she's weak. And it goes on and on and on. And while all this is going on, the therapist is looking and saying, I don't know how to deal with this. And the client sitting there saying, how can I answer your question? I'm confused. I believe that Mart's psychotherapist told us that story for a reason that he didn't even understand himself. Because as he told us that story, it showed to us what I now believe is very close to what our son has been living for many years, if not his entire life. Because I then related back to his psychotherapist things that awoke in me, in my own memory, from my son's life, that was so close to that. The way Mart would say to us, I can't tell you. We'd say, who's doing this to you? And he says, I can't tell you, I can't tell you. And then he would say, the Spanish man. And then he would say, no, it's not the Spanish man. And we'd say, who's the Spanish man? And he'd say, it's nobody, it's nobody. It doesn't matter. There's no person, it's not the Spanish man, there's nobody. The psychotherapist has over the months built up some relationship with Mart. And he established very recently that the Spanish man actually has a name.
Right.
I won't say the name, because it may well be a name that Mart has picked up from someone he knows in his life. But let's say Pedro Gonzalez.
Mm.
And he says, the Spanish man is Pedro Gonzalez. And then he tried to explore more about this, and Mart shut up. He says, I'm not telling you anymore. I can't tell you anymore. What we're learning, I believe, is that these many characters that live within our son's head have come from his memories. Now they may be historic memories that predate his life, but they may be memories, and we think many of them date within his lifetime and within a particular period of his lifetime. His teen years particularly important in this respect. And in a way, the behaviors that we've seen from our son in his psychotic episodes over the years resemble the behaviors that we would see in these characters. The way our son appears to bully us, his family, we thought was some sort of a possession or demonic thing. You know, sorry for the play on the word there, but I mean like the traditional use of the word demonic, possession. And therefore you want to try and exorcise that, don't you? Your inclination is to exorcise that. It's an evil thing that's present that you need to get rid of. And we were kind of waking up to the fact that perhaps these are just his memories. These are things that live with him. These are things that make him up, that make him what he is. And you cannot remove those things. And his psychotherapist was very clear with us. Do not attempt to remove them. He will be frightened by that. They will lock up. They will not talk to you anymore. They will put him under pressure inside his inner world. All of these characters will be afraid of being removed. They will fear that we're harming the host, our son, and they will close up. And we will continue to see them behave in their worst way, in the independent, what did you call it? Not this multiple, dissociative way. They'll continue to be disassociated from him and from the others in that inner world. And they'll behave in their way. And we were seeing these many personalities. We would see a quiet crying person in the corner sometimes, saying, why me, why me? And then we'd say, it's okay, Mark, put our arms on him. Then he'd hit us and say, get away from me, you know, who are you? And he would alter personality moments by moment by moment. And so we really didn't know what we were doing with him. How can you help someone like that? But knowing there's a probability that these are simply his inner world personalities been disassociated from him and continuing in that way, we've been able to try a different approach. And it's working. It is working. Every time since we learned this, every time one of them appears and it's usually the leader or the bully who's in there, we simply stand back, and we have to stay away and protect ourselves a little because he can be very violent. We say, don't fear anything. We're not trying to get rid of you. We're trying to help you to have a calm, peaceful life. And within minutes of us using that approach, given that we managed to stay close enough without being afraid for our well-being, he would calm a little bit. And he'd drop into another personality. There'd be someone else who'd be a smiling, happy person.
Wow.
And this has improved over the last few weeks. It's quite recent. This is as recent as a month or two ago. And he's been living with this for 5 or 6 years at its worst. And who knows how long.
So if you approach each one of these personalities, excuse me, this is fabulous. If you approach each one of these personalities as an individual person and address them instead of addressing him in the situation, it seems to be working. In other words, you're recognizing these personalities